quite often I just binge some random YouTube content, like YouTube poker content, and I watch a guy, and his approach maybe is very, like, I think I see this quite commonly at least. They're trying to like replicate theory and talk about why, but they just completely ignore like what they think humans are actually doing. They're like, like I
Yeah.
should use this sizing on the river, and like I should bluff this combo, and it's like, bro, the guy's range calling you here. Like he's taken such a strong line.
So the idea that we've, we're looking to put across here is to give you kind of a bit of an outline as to, as we say, the thought process or the considerations, the things that you can ask yourself in game to come to a more accurate decision than just a blanket one-size-fits-all answer that is, okay, yeah, bluff here, don't bluff here. The game is complex, people are complex, there's a lot of things to consider, but as I say, unfortunately, we can't give you a one-size-fits-all answer, or fortunately, because the game would be very boring if it was that easy, wouldn't it? So,
hey, what's up, Run It Once? This is Patrick Sekinger, PSEC1, and today I have with me fellow pro Simon Draper, who I'm sure you guys are familiar with. And today we're going to be doing kind of a dual commentary, maybe, or at least a study topic together, which is about exploitative bluffing and bluff catching. I'll let Simon give a little brief intro as to himself now, but yeah.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Glad to have you all on board for this video. Really excited to get into this. I think we've got a lot of good stuff in this presentation that we're going to go over. It's going to be a two-part video as well, where we're going to have some practical hand histories, even a bit of a quiz. So yeah, let's get it going and let's see where it takes us, mate.
Yeah, sounds good. Also looking forward to this. We've done a good bit of prep, and I think what we've got is gonna probably turn some heads maybe with some of it. But let's get into it.
In a good way.
So yeah, in a good way.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it makes the most sense to kind of begin by talking about theory in general and how that translates into the games that we're playing. So, for example, if in theory we have knowledge or an assumption that our opponent is going to overfold compared to GTO, the max exploitative response is to bluff every hand that we get there with, and vice versa. So if we expect to overcall, it will be to bluff nothing. Now, how do you think this is going to go for us in game, Simon?
Well, it's very difficult to know. I mean, this is the game itself, isn't it? Like, poker is a game of incomplete information, and it can be very difficult to have a 100%, 10 out of 10 read on your opponent where you can go, I know he's going to overfold, or I know he's going to overcall, and therefore I'm going to exploit him to the maximum. I'm going to bluff every bluff, or I'm going to give up with every single bluff. So this is I think a problem that a lot of people face both in-game and out of game as well when they're reviewing hands. And as I say, the kind of idea behind this video is to kind of formulate a little bit of a process that can help steer you in the right direction between, okay, maybe in this particular spot we can, max exploit our opponent and bluff every bluff, or do something in between maybe. But the issue is in game is you can never truly know, and I think this is something that a lot of poker players struggle with at the end of the day. So it's kind of dealing with that incomplete information and making almost your best guess, I think is the best way of putting it.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think, as you say, like, we can never have perfect clairvoyance over villain strategy. So it's not that useful to say, I think he's going to overfold here, I'm going to bluff everything, because you leave yourself open to a lot of exploitation. And again, like you say, it's very, very hard to have that degree of confidence. There has to be some kind of middle ground. And so that's kind of what we're going to explore today together. So that kind of brings us nicely onto the first slide, which is a well-known approach to this kind of concept, right? Which is MDA. Now, for people who might not have heard about MDA, what's your understanding of it, Simon?
So it stands for mass database analysis. The idea is that you create a database based on not just the singular opponent that you're up against, but your player pool. And then you analyze how the player pool reacts in certain spots. And then you can build a exploitative framework based on the aggregate, right? Based on what the general population is doing overall. And then you devise your game plan based on, for example, the population may overfold to triple barrels in single raise pots. So therefore, your exploitative approach can therefore then be, okay, if I arrive to the river and I've double barreled the turn, I know on the aggregate that my population is going to overfold the river. So therefore, I'm just going to bluff every bluff. It's a very black and white strategy. It's a very simple strategy to try and employ. But of course, hence the slide, it does have its downsides and it does have its pitfalls.
Yeah, exactly. Like you say, it's a very binary strategy. It's either you are over bluffing because it's overfolded, or you're never bluffing because it's overcalled, and there's no flexibility within that framework. And so, as far as pitfalls are concerned, we're going to kind of talk about what those might be now. So the first thing is, quite often there is data within the data, as we've coined it. So what we mean by that is, let's say we have a sample of all of the hands that I've played for the last 12 months. Let's say it's 1 million hands for argument's sake. Now, that's going to be broken down by frequency into all of the different nodes that I've played. And so we can, like Simon used in his example, maybe we see that population's overfolding to triple barrels. The problem is it doesn't take into consideration things such as the board texture. So there might be certain board textures which aren't overfolded, and there might be certain board textures which are significantly overfolded. But if we're kind of basing it on the aggregate, our strategy, there's room within that for it to be very bad in some scenarios and potentially very good in other ones. And we don't have very good vision as to maybe what that is. And I guess a further thing in relation to the board texture is, once you start to bracket the data into, textural kind of understanding, you are then going to struggle as far as the sample size is concerned. And then you're going to have a less representative picture of actually what population is doing. So yeah, that's kind of like one of the first ones.
Just to advance on that as well, it can be you've always got to be very careful when you're looking at any kind of data, even if it's just, you're playing in game and you have your, HUD stats in front of you, to be careful as to the sample size that is required to get a reliable piece of data. It can be very, very easy to read a set of data like river folding stats, for example, and then make a conclusion, but the sample size is not sufficient enough for that conclusion to have any weight. And this is a mistake I think a lot of people make. They make big conclusions based on incomplete data and incomplete information, and it can result in you coming to the wrong conclusion and bluffing every bluff, when in fact, if you were to have 10 million hands, for example, in this particular spot, then it might say otherwise. So you do have to take any kind of data that you see, always, I think, with a little bit of a pinch of salt, is the best way of putting it for me.
Yeah, 100%. And then again, if we kind of continue in this vein with further potential issues, you've got player types. So I think the easiest example to think of here is like regs categorized by one when saw flop. Just because it's the easiest way of kind of filtering out guys who are a bit nittier, guys who are a bit more aggressive, guys who are more normal, quote unquote, as far as like kind of aggression stats are concerned. And maybe all those different regs are going to respond differently to certain lines or certain aggressions or certain actions. Maybe nit regs are going to overfold to delay c-bet, and maybe aggressive regs are going to underfold to delay c-bet. So again, it's really, really important to kind of factor in this stuff as well. I guess further to that, very quickly, we can just talk about like positional relativity. So, wide range scenarios versus narrow range scenarios. You're going to, again, have quite different data as a result of that too. So, yeah.
Yeah, the spot plays, for example, again, using a single raise pot, if you're playing button versus big blind in a wider range scenario, the spot is going to play very, very differently in terms of how people react than, say, for example, early position versus the big blind, both in terms of how you should bluff, but also how people are likely to react, which we will get into later in the video. We're going to talk about that an awful lot, but it's very difficult to, again, within the data, be able to bracket certain positions in certain spots because, again, you're relying on sample and so on. But it does make a massive, massive difference as to how you should bluff, for example, from early position as opposed to the button and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I completely agree there. Okay, so another thing to think about is that if you are approaching the game from the mass data kind of side of things, and that's how you're constructing your strategy, you potentially leave yourself up to exploitation, because how the pool of players reacts to the average player might be different to how the specific reg you're playing against in that moment reacts to you specifically. I would kind of suggest that the average player who's, again, basing their strategy a little bit more on data and doing so in like a maximally exploitative way is probably going to be more aggressive than the average reg in the pool. So it's possible that, again, guys are overfolding a certain node, but versus you, if they are trying again to counter exploit, and we'll talk about the reality of this and whether or not the players who are playing are actually able to do this. But yeah, they might be playing differently versus you compared with the pool. And so therefore, what you're basing your strategy on is maybe not perfectly representative of the scenario in game.
Yeah, I agree. I think just to advance on this as well, I think it's a good point to make that a lot of the time we think of like an being exploited, we tend to think of it as something that is conscious, like our opponent is exploiting us and he's consciously making that decision to do so. I think this isn't necessarily the case. Sometimes your opponent can be unconsciously exploiting your strategy. They might not realize that they're overfolding a certain spot, which actually exploits you because you are underbluffing the spot, or vice versa. So it's important to kind of consider all of these things that could be happening on the river, when you're about to make your river bet, for example. Your opponent is a human as well, and they may be down 5 stacks today, and therefore they've just decided to press the call button because they're down 5 stacks. And it's very easy, the point that I'm trying to make here is it's very easy for you to kind of get exploited by playing this hyper exploitative strategy without even your opponent just going, I know he's over bluffing, therefore I'm just going to range call. Oftentimes it can be a little bit more subtle than that. And again, it's just one of those many things that we're going to talk about that you kind of just have to factor in a little bit.
Yeah, 100%. But kind of following on from that point, and this is arguably one of the advantages of the NDA approach, is that when you are playing in games which are anonymous, I would argue quite strongly that it's very likely going to be max EV in those scenarios. We'll kind of go on a bit more as to why this is a little bit deeper in the video, but if Villain doesn't know who you are, but you have very good information as to what the average player in the pool is doing, you're going to be able to make much better decisions than a player who is coming from more of a pure theory approach, as we're going to kind of look at in the next slide. So that is kind of, we've spoken a lot about the pitfalls, but in certain scenarios, MDA in particular is very, very, very valuable.
Yes, completely agree.
Cool. And just to kind of finish off this slide, we kind of note here about how the cost of making an exploitative adjustment and getting it wrong is potentially catastrophic to your win rate. We're going to show a pretty cool solver-based explanation, or maybe not explanation, but a solver-based illustration of exactly like a cool way of modeling this under certain different assumptions. And kind of illustrating that a very binary approach, as we kind of mentioned earlier, that the MDA tends to be, can potentially leave you up to like huge exploit if Villain is aware of what you're doing. And again, the reality of that, arguable to the extent.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've spoken about the sort of mass data approach. The alternative approach, I would argue, or one of the more common alternative approaches, is coming from a theory approach. So what's your understanding of what that means when I kind of say that?
So it's the age-old debate, isn't it? Should we, try and play GTO, or should we try and play exploitative? And, the theory approach is oftentimes, you go into a GTO wizard, or you'll go into a Pyro solver, or whatever solver it might be, and you look to replicate what you see in the sims. And obviously anybody who's playing poker in this day and age who wants to, study and is serious about getting better has often experimented with a solver here and there. And the theory approach that we're talking about here is the idea of, okay, we arrive to the river, we have an equilibrium strategy, which the solver spits out. Let's try to copy that. And with that in mind, we know that our strategy is going to make us X amount of money based on how we execute said strategy. So it's a more rigid approach to arriving to the river and deciding whether to bluff or not. You are very simply going to be asking yourself almost the question of, okay, I wouldn't necessarily say this is the best way of doing it, but would the solver bluff here, for example? And then you can go ahead and check afterwards, and you can see, okay, well, my hand is a pure bluff, or my hand is a pure give up, etc. This is the idea behind the theory-based approach. As I say, a little bit more rigid and less, adjustable than an exploitative approach, but still has its merits, but also still has an awful lot of pitfalls, I would say.
Yeah, it's like you say though, Simon, it's the attractiveness of playing a strategy which is quote unquote unexploitable, right? That's what we mean by equilibrium. It's within a certain set of parameters, whether that's like the two ranges you're using, the bet sizes you're using, can we replicate a strategy which is unexploitable, i.e., villain cannot make any money versus us, or like cannot exploit us to any degree.
Yeah.
And that, for obvious reasons, if we're able to do that well, that is very, very, very attractive. I mean, one of the biggest problems, of course, of that is that there is an assumption that villain is also some kind of player trying to play perfectly. So it's like it's the unexploitable strategy under the assumption of clairvoyance over the two players. Well, villain has no clairvoyance over you, you have no clairvoyance over villain, and so very, very often you can make more money than the theory-based approach by playing a more exploitative style. So it's the kind of weighing up of the two things. So more generally, I guess, talking about pitfalls of this approach, the first one is like frequencies. This is one that you brought up, Simon, I'm pretty sure. So I'll kind of let you talk about exactly what you meant by frequencies.
Yeah, so I think one of the main pros of a theory-based approach is it does actually give you it gives you a degree of certainty, which is something that we all tend to look for in poker and, more philosophically in life. Where you can plug your hand into the solver afterwards and you can see whether you got the answer right or you got the answer wrong. And in terms of frequencies, the difficulty that you can have is that the solver will often bluff at mixed frequencies with certain hands, and it will bluff at mixed frequencies globally overall. It's very, very rare that you'll find a situation in the solver where you can quite literally just bluff every bluff. It does happen, it does exist, and it would be very easy to implement that kind of strategy if you know you arrive to the river in a certain scenario and you go, well, I can just bluff everything here. Very easy to accomplish that. The issue becomes when you arrive to the river, and maybe the river is, let's say we're in a single raise pot, it's Jack 9-5, we see bet the flop, and the turn is a 2. We decide to double barrel, and then the river comes down another 2, which in general is going to be a pretty bad river overall for our range, because our range contains a lot of air, and our opponent's range at this point, if they've called 2 bets, is very narrow and condensed around made hands and pairs. So we're not doing very well overall, and we arrive to the river with a lot of air compared to the amount of value hands that we have. So therefore, we're not allowed to bluff every bluff, and we need to then decide how often we're allowed to bluff overall. And then we also need to delve deeper and then think about, okay, how good is my hand as a bluff? And sometimes, as mentioned, your hand could be making no money checking and making no money bluffing, and therefore you have to do a little bit of both. And the problem with this is that you only have especially if you play online, you only have a finite amount of time in-game to figure this out. Even if you are able to figure it out, the accuracy with which you're able to do so can often be way, way off. This is the problem that you have when you try to bluff like a solver. It's managing these frequencies and actually making your opponent indifferent, which is the goal. If you're trying to play this theory-based approach, it's very difficult to do, unfortunately. And especially when the run out is a little bit more complex than, say, the really nice river where you can bluff every bluff.
Yeah. So this is kind of, I guess, if we're comparing NDA in theory, you've done a really good job there of describing one of the main difficulties, which is MDA quite often, again, with its binary nature, you have this bluff is gonna be plus EV because population overfolds. Let's bluff. End of question. Don't have to think anymore. If we're taking this approach, conversely, it's okay. This bluff in theory is 0 EV if villain is playing a good strategy. I have my whole range. How am I prioritizing my bluffs given my value range? How many bluffs do I get to bluff so that I'm not over bluffing this spot? And so villain is correctly indifferent and my strategy is unexploitable. So yeah, very, very, very complicated as you kind of touch on. The other thing, of course, is that the problem with a theory approach is that it's only an equilibrium within a set of fixed parameters. And are we going to have perfect clairvoyance over what ranges villain is using at any point in time? The answer is no in every single case. And you can think of this both from like a practicality standpoint and from like as a human, right? Let's say, for example, you are playing, I don't know, 1KNL on GG, and you have some solve which tells you what perfect ranges are, but you're a human being, and you're playing 9 tables, and you've got four buzzers going off at you because you've got 4 different decisions to make at the same time. Are you going to be playing perfect ranges in that exact spot? Probably not. Even if you have perfect amount of time, are you going to replicate every frequency of every combo in every scenario? Probably not. So it's important to remember that when we're looking at solves, they are solves within fixed parameters, and they are approximations, basically, of what the actual strategy villain is going to be playing is. And it's obviously going to have implications to us. Yeah, I guess that's kind of a little side thing. And then, of course, knowledge restrictions that we have noted here is going to kind of be more about, again, with MDA, very often the answer is binary, and it's very quick, and this is kind of the beautiful thing about the MDA strategy in a way, is that as humans, and I'm trying to not get too derailed here, but like we love positive and negative feedback loops. We like to be able to, as kind of Simon was describing, we like to make an action, go back, check whether it was the right action, maybe in the solver, or maybe in our database of population data, and then get the answer. Now, in the population data, if you take it as gospel, you're getting this positive and negative feedback immediately. Yes, this is a good spot to bluff. No, this is a bad spot to bluff. Yes, this is a good spot to go thin for value. No, this is a bad spot to go thin for value. All this kind of stuff. Whereas within the solver, it's like, if villain is playing under these ranges, which I think are correct, and under these bet sizing schemes, which I think are correct, and kind of, there's a lot more, you're not getting the positive and negative feedback loops. And of course, as far as knowledge restrictions go, I realize I got a bit off camera there, but as far as knowledge restrictions go, you have to have you spend a lot of time off the table studying the theory. Why does the solver bet this sizing in this spot? Why does it prioritize these hands? And there's so much that you do know, but also so much that you don't know that, it's harder as an overall approach to practically applying game, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, how many times have you been, sat there on the river and the river has come down a really strange card, and then you're like, shit, I don't know what to do on this. I don't know what's going on. Because the river has changed the board completely, and you kind of, again, we're human beings, you kind of have this like 5 seconds of meltdown, really, where you're trying to figure out what's going on before you can even activate that sort of, rational part of your brain to go, okay, well, let's try and figure this out, and let's try and figure out whether I should bluff or whether I shouldn't bluff. It's very, very easy to study using the solver and then just roll off, as mentioned before, but the brick to river. But you can't study every single river card. You can try to simplify things to quantify different river cards and group them together, but there's always going to be that river where you don't really know what to do. And as I say, the game is endless. The game is, really, really limitless. And there's going to be many, many spots if you just apply this theory, led approach, where you're just not going to know. And a lot of the time, that's where people come unstuck a little bit. It's okay, are you now good enough to figure it out to the best of your knowledge? Or are you just going to, move the mouse and slowly hover over bet when you shouldn't, or hover over check when you shouldn't? It's very easy when you have a restriction in your knowledge to then default to what you're kind of pre-programmed, quote unquote, to do as a human being, I think a lot of the time.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, definitely agree with what you say there, and it's tough, man, being a human playing playing a game which is much easier if you're a computer, you know.
Yeah, you're not wrong. You're not wrong.
But yeah,
our summer sale at Run It Once is happening right now with thousands of videos and 2 new videos added every day. You'll always have fresh insights to keep your game sharp. You can watch how players study. They can teach you the lessons that they've learned from solvers, and you can see them apply it at the tables in real time. If you want to compete with the best, you need to train like them. Run It Once Elite. Sign up today and get inside of the minds of some of the world's best pros. Head over to runitonce.com to take advantage now.
I think the other thing, again, just kind of touching on the last slide here, if you are strictly trying to just replicate theory mindlessly, you can quite often neglect key information, which is really, really important to your overall win rate, your overall EV. It's like super, super common that, I don't know about you guys, or you, Simon, in particular, but like the viewers as well. Quite often I just binge some random YouTube content, like YouTube poker content, and I watch a guy and his approach maybe is very, like, I think I see this quite commonly at least. They're trying to like replicate theory and talk about why, but they just completely ignore like what they think humans are actually doing. They're like, like I should use this sizing on the river, and like I should bluff this combo, and it's like, bro, the guy's range calling you here. Like he's taken such a strong line, you know.
Yeah,
and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, you get check raised, and then, you know, they bomb the turn, and then they bomb the river, and you're in a bluff catching spot, for example. But it's just a, you know, super tight guy who's acted very, very quickly on every single street. You play against him every day, and you can't remember the last time he's shown you a bluff. You know, if you're theory orientated in this regard, you might have your 0 EV bluff catcher, and you just decide to do that because you're being theory orientated, when you kind of completely ignore all of the signs and maybe your own intuition and things like that can cause you to see, you know, your opponent's just not bluffing you here. It comes with experience, or, you know, as I say, vice versa. You might be in a situation where, you know, you've 2x potted the turn, and then your opponent's taken 3 seconds and called you, and he's like a semi-recreational player. You should know immediately then that, okay, yeah, we're probably going to need to give up here, even if, you know, you have what you might think is a pretty good bluffing candidate. As I say, being theory orientated with your approach can be very, very rigid. So we're going to talk about it a little bit more, but there's a middle ground at the end of the day. You know, you should always continue to think and look for information that your opponent is going to give you, rather than almost autopiloting and just doing what the solver does because you're a slave to the solver, for example.
Yeah, 100%. Like, it's a game of imperfect information, right? And the more information you can take from every avenue, the better that's going to be for you in terms of making good decisions, which is ultimately what we're all trying to do, right? Whether that information is based on, you know, data research, whether it's based on what you know about theory, and of course based on like metagame considerations, or like you say, timing tells, all of this kind of stuff. It all paints a picture, and that's kind of, yeah, I think what we should be aiming to do. Use as much information as is readily available to us, and yeah, going from there. So now, in my opinion, one of the cooler parts of this session, if you want to call it that, which is we're going to kind of use GTO Wizard, which is one of the readily available solvers on the market nowadays. You've also got PioSolver and, you know, other solvers as well. But yeah, we're going to use GTO Wizard, and we're going to kind of model the two different approaches, and I think it should hopefully illustrate quite well what we're trying to say about the rigidity of the two and the exploitability of the two. In terms of exploitability, the easiest way to think about this is in terms of percentage of the pot that is lost or gained. And yeah, we're just going to kind of get into it now. Very quickly, what we have in the background here, I think the ranges themselves are not that important as far as this is concerned, because ultimately all we're doing is we're modeling, again, a scenario within a rigid set of parameters. and then kind of seeing how two different approaches might respond to something on the level of exploitability of each.
Yeah.
So we just got a standard wide range scenario, button versus big blind, single raise pot. As I said, the exact range is not super important, at least. So king 7-3, check, range bet. But yeah, again, pretty common stuff. Check, polarized strategy on a super blank. I like Simon's example of the deuce. It's like the quintessential nothing card, right?
It's always the first one you gravitate to it. Let's do a 2-turn, shall we? Let's have a look at that.
Exactly. So we've gone deuce. So essentially, and also actually kind of part of the reason why we're modeling this on the river is that it allows us to, there's no future streets to be played. So it's the easiest spot to model from like a toy game point of view. So we have this overbet strategy. Again, no real point talking about exactly what this is or what this means, because really we're interested in the river. So partly why I think the deuces are another very good river to look at is in this line where we get the option of triple barrel. Firstly, out of position is not playing any leads, so there's no complication there. The other thing is villain is largely, or the in-position player, I should say, is largely playing jam or check.
Yeah.
One limitation of potentially, again, we're going to use node lock, I should say, actually. But yeah, one limitation of if there's multiple sizes in node locking one is that one player might be able to shuffle hands into the unnode locked size in order to kind of circumvent the real EV loss here. So when I say node lock, Simon, what do you understand it to mean?
So I think it was just firstly pretty cool and important. Just, you know, whenever you're kind of making like a toy game in this kind of situation, or you want to model something, the river is always the street to do it. And as Patrick says, you want to keep it really simple. So wherever you can, try and make everything just one size, because the solver is cheeky and it will try and cheat. With regards to node locking, essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to force the solver to play a suboptimal strategy, i.e., we're going to make them bluff too much, or we're going to make it bluff too little in this particular example, and then we're going to have a look at the responses. So it's essentially forcing the solver to maybe, in a certain situation, play a bit more like a human being. And then what we can do is we can analyze the EV loss that our custom strategy is causing both us as, say, the in-position player, or villain as the out-of-position player, and vice versa. It's always a great tool to study with and to kind of understand when you are looking at, you know, potentially different river spots and things like that, because the adjustments are, as we're going to see, very big, and the EV loss and EV gain can also be extremely large. And I think it helps you kind of understand the game on a little bit more of like a holistic, is that the right word? But like a big picture sort of viewpoint. Probably not the right word, is it? But on a bigger scale, a bigger picture, rather than just constantly just looking at, say, the equilibrium sim that the solver spits out. Play around with stuff and see what changes. A lot of the time when you're studying the game, if you analyze what changes, then you often get these like light bulb moments that can kind of lead you down a path to further discovery, shall we say.
Just very quickly to touch on the limitations of node locking, like anything, you're making big assumptions. So let's say, like, and also as well, again, if I kind of touch back on like what do humans like versus don't like, they like positive reinforcement. So you can pretty much always go into a solver and justify some play that you made based on, you can say, oh, I think villain's range is inaccurate here. I'm just going to like remove these combos and I'm just going to like make him do this, that. And it's like, oh yeah, cool, good play. Yeah, nice one. Pat myself on the back, move on. But again, the whole point is node locking is very assumptive. The more assumptions you're making, the less, or just the more you open yourself up to exploitation yourself, I guess. So yeah, anyway. All I'm really going to do firstly is I'm just going to remove the 50% bet sizing. It's such an infrequent sizing anyway that I don't think this is really an issue. Let's lock the in-position player here. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying lock. This is the optimal strategy for in-position, and I'm going to make sure he plays perfectly optimal. So this is kind of modeling a guy who is maybe trying to, again, replicate a theory approach. All right. But let's say we're playing against population. And in this spot, again, this is the optimal defense for the opposition player. They're supposed to always call King Jack plus because it's a value catcher where imposition's shoving King Jack themselves. And then also some of these, as Simon was talking about, mixed frequency bluff catchers. I think Simon was talking about in the context of bluffs, but it works both ways, right? Vice versa. Now we have a bluff catcher. It's technically 0 EV. Now, very quickly, why are we calling these sometimes on the river? Simon, like, what is it about them? Why are we calling them sometimes?
So I mean, overall, first of all, we have to defend a certain amount of hands, right? Otherwise, we're just going to be overfolding. Secondly, in terms of the specific hands that you want to call, obviously you've covered King Jack. If we beat our opponent's, we chop with our opponent's value, then we have to call. So you can see King Queen and King Jack is always going to call. The King 10 offs, King 9 offs, King 8 offs, King 7 offs, and so on. Actually, King 7 offs is 2 pair, isn't it? But the other hands in our range, they are going to call or fold oftentimes based on their blocker properties. So when you're in the looking at an equilibrium solution, the solver doesn't have any adjustment to go off at the equilibrium. So we're going to just basically be looking at card removal in a lot of these situations. So for example, if you have King 6 of diamonds, as you've got hovered over here, the card removal with regards to that is going to either, in this situation, is probably going to unblock more bluffs from our opponent as opposed to, say, King 6 of clubs. So therefore, you can see the EV difference in the sim is actually 2 big blinds here based on how our opponent is going to be bluffing the river and what hands they're going to be using to bluff the river. We can kind of, when we're in game, for example, we can start to think about our blocker properties and things like that. But from a very zoomed out perspective, you can kind of treat these as the same. They are effectively 0 EV bluff catchers when you don't consider the blocker properties.
Yeah, 100%. And sorry, I didn't cut you off.
No, go
okay,
for it,
cool. Yeah, I was just gonna say, and like the reason that we call them sometimes is because villain has like and this is kind of what I'm literally about to illustrate. But if we fold them always, we're folding at such a frequency that in position is able to increase the EV of their strategy by bluffing non-showdown value hands more, right? So that's kind of why. So what I'm now going to do, so I've locked in position to just play perfect strategy. I'm going to lock us as the out of position player here to only call the value catchers. So let's say maybe I'm playing in a live game and I'm playing against a really nitty guy, and I've just decided that I'm only he's going to overfold, right? So his strategy looks something like this. Now, what we're modeling in this scenario is how much EV does the optimal strategy gain if villain is playing a very suboptimal strategy, right? So I'm going to lock all of these, which they are. No lock, and that's exactly what we're going to see now. Now, imposition has gained 9.3% of the pot. So an exploitative strategy against the big blind can win 9.3% of the pot. A pure theory-oriented strategy will gain 0.1. So you're talking a 93x increase in EV here by not playing pure theory. I mean, that's pretty massive, right?
Yeah, the scale of that is something to just sit with, I think, for a moment, isn't it?
Yeah, you're winning 93 times more by being able to, not be perfectly rigid. Now, what we're going to do is the exact reverse of this as well. So I'm now going to force the in-position player to range bluff. And we're going to see how much more exploitable or less exploitable that might be if the big blind is able to shift their strategy too. And again, this is kind of, I think it illustrates the same point largely, but fun to do nonetheless. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lock this. I'm also going to go back and I'm going to let the in-position player shove these hands for value that it was before. So it's not a complete joke sim. So we're going to lock that shoving range. I might have to go back actually and unlock the whole thing. Bear with me.
This is going to be interesting though, because we'll see the other side of things. And this is, well, I mean, we'll illustrate it in a second, but it's Exploiting is always a double-edged sword, in that, yes, we can gain 93 times the amount of EV that we gain just by playing our theory-orientated strategy. But if our opponent adjusts, we might be in serious trouble. And I think this is, again, a really nice sort of illustration of this.
Bluff everything that has no showdown value. As we saw, the kind of like optimal counter response to the big blind's nittiness was. And we're going to see how much EV this strategy can lose against a clairvoyant villain who is able to counter-exploit you. And before, we saw that the big blind was able to gain 9%, and now what we see is that the big blind is able... I mean, the button here has lost 45% pot share. Oh, it's 35%, sorry. So, you know, the big blind was able to gain 9, and now being able to adjust again is, you know, able to gain 35%. So pretty, like, massively crazy swings in EV. And again, this is to remember that, like, logically the framework is versus an overfolding villain, the max EV play is to bluff everything, right? Which is kind of what an MDA approach looks like. It's like, we expect population to overfold this node, so we're going to bluff everything. In doing that, as we kind of illustrated, we can gain 9% of the pot. But the level at which our strategy becomes exploitable is magnitudes higher than that. As we can see here, if villain is clairvoyant that we are range bluffing this spot and elects to range callers, we now lose 35% of the pot. So we stood to gain 9, but we have lost 35. And again, contrary to this, if we are playing a perfectly optimal strategy and villain is, you know, overfolding, we're only gaining 0.1% of the pot. So wild variations that we've kind of illustrated here in, just the exploitability of having such binary strategies one direction or the other.
Yeah, it's what's the best way of putting it? A cautionary tale, definitely, because as I say, exploiting your opponents is fantastic, and we should look to do it as much as we possibly can. But if they do cotton onto what we're doing and do decide to just range call us in a situation where we're bluffing every buff, it's very easy for the win rate, that we have over a long period of time to just be completely torched and completely lit on fire if you do this sort of stuff too much and people figure you out. So, yeah, careful is the best way of putting it, I think. But I think it's a really nice illustration of just how crazy it is and how much money you can lose very quickly just by always bluffing your queen 6 or whatever it might be.
Again, though, this is in theory, right? And the practicality of all of the things that we've illustrated are that it's not going to be replicable to our reality. And now I sound like my economics lecturer from uni, which chilled the fuck out of me whenever he was like, in all of this stuff we've learned, we just can't apply it. So now we're going to tell you how can we apply this in game and actually, you know, use this knowledge to our advantage.
Yeah.
That kind of brings us on to the next slide. This is kind of what I said. There is no answer. There is no right or wrong answer, I guess, is really what that should say. There's no one approach that is definitely better than the other. There are scenarios where one approach might actually be better than the other in particular. What considerations are important, though, is kind of what we are aiming to deliver to you within this presentation, so you can actually take away information that you can apply to improve your own decision-making process in game, ultimately.
Yeah, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's, you know, each spot that you get into, this is why we love the game, is everything's a little bit individual. So the idea that we've, you know, we're looking to put across here is to give you kind of a bit of an outline as to, as we say, the thought process or the considerations, the things that you can ask yourself in game to come to a more accurate decision than just a blanket one-size-fits-all answer that is, okay, yeah, bluff here, don't bluff here. You know, the game is complex, people are complex, there's a lot of things to consider, but as I say, unfortunately, we can't give you a one-size-fits-all answer. Or fortunately, because the game would be very boring if it was that easy, wouldn't it? So
that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of certain information that we can, take in game that is sort of aside from the strategy stuff or like the pure strategy stuff. I think one thing that we have written here is like the meta game. So timing reads. I think again, timing reads are information that exists, and I think a lot of people ignore them.
Yeah.
At least from my experience with coaching students, a lot of them don't necessarily consider them, or maybe they misinterpret what they mean in certain instances as well. But yeah, do we have any timing reads? Again, the accuracy of timing reads, in my opinion, is stronger with recreational players than professional players, largely because of the reality of a professional player's grind setting. They're very frequently going to be playing multiple tables. Sometimes they may take a while to make a decision on one table just because they've got a really tough decision on another one, not because the actual decision on that table is tough. So there's certainly some like false positives, or false negatives even, maybe.
Yeah.
That we can kind of see here. So timing reads, and then you've got kind of, further considerations.
Yeah, I mean, not just on the timing reads, I think a nice point to make with regards to recreationals versus regs is if you have a said timing read, how you use that is often very different versus a reg than versus a recreational. The one I always like is a snap call. Just a general point on timing reads with regards, I like looking at quick decisions because quick decisions do tend to be quite accurate. If you do get snap called on the turn, you can very easily just rule out the fact that your opponent considered folding or they considered raising, unless it's a reverse tell, right, which is going to be very, very rare. But generally speaking, versus a recreational who's snap called the turn, which is going to happen an awful lot, you can then basically bucket them to, okay, well, they have a hand that never considered folding or never considered raising, so they're always around this sort of, okay, easy call region. So my take on this is if I have a timing read and I'm thinking about bluffing the river versus a recreational, if they've snap called the turn versus me, I'm going to not pull the trigger very often because I know they have something of something, and I'm not really in the business of trying to make recreationals fold made hands. I don't think that's always the best way of doing things. However, if I'm playing a reg who snap calls the turn, and more regs do this than you might think, because again, like Patrick said, they have lots of decisions going on, and look, if you're playing 8 tables at a time, you have to act very quickly, so a lot of the stuff becomes a little bit more automatic. The beauty of timing reads is it's very difficult to mask them when you're playing so many tables. If a reg snap calls the turn, you can again rule out the fact that he thought about calling or he thought about raising. But a reg who has a mid-strength heavy range, I don't mind bluffing the river more versus them because a reg is more likely to fold second pair than a recreational is. So it's just a nice little, a little bit of a tangent there. But it's not only do you have maybe a specific read or timing read on your opponent, it's what you do with it, and how you adjust it.
Other considerations about, is a bluff going to be profitable or unprofitable, and am I going to get overcalled or undercalled? The intuitiveness of bluffs. So is the board really blank where bluffs are coming from total air? In fact, if we go back to the GTO Wiz Sim that I brought up before, it was King 7 3 deuce, I think. There's some straight draws on that board, but I remember, for example, Queen 6 of nothing was double barreling at some frequency. It's a blank enough board where the bluffs, from a solver point of view, are potentially unintuitive, whereas a board which maybe like Jack 10, 5, 8, the bluffs are all going to come predominantly from like equitable hands, which is a bit more intuitive to actually find from a human point of view. And so, yeah, what influence does this have on the river? Is the river blank? Is the river a draw completer? Like, what's your intuition, Simon, about that in particular? Like, if the river's a blank versus some kind of draw completion, do you think it's like, how do you perceive, thinking about your decision maybe as the defensive player in this scenario?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when the river completes a draw, the bluffs are very intuitive. So the classic example is going to be, let's use King 7 3 2, but then the river's laid of 5 completing the flush. In that kind of situation, let's make it King 9 3 2 5, right, where the river completes a flush. That situation, the bluffs are really intuitive. If you imagine, say, button versus big blind, because you're just going to have like a lot of offsuit 1 flush cards in your range. So, for example, like if the flush is diamonds, you've got a lot of, say, Queen Jack offsuit with a diamond, Jack 10 offsuit with a diamond, etc., etc. So it's very, very easy when a flush completes on the river to find those bluffs and therefore to follow through. On blank rivers, things get a bit more complex and they get a lot more difficult. As Patrick says, like, if you're not barreling the turn correctly and you're not finding the lower equity bluffs, then it can be very, very difficult to bluff the river effectively. But also, likewise, if you're only, just bringing it back to a draw completing river, if you're only bluffing equity driven on the turn, then it's very easy to underbluff because you don't have the lower equity turn barrels in your range in order to still have bluffs on the river. So, you know, if it was a straight and flush completing river and you only have a bluff in straight draws and flush draws on the turn, then what do you have left to bluff with at the end of the day? Just going back to the blank rivers, as I say, they tend to be more complex and more counterintuitive. In theory, blank rivers are often very bad if you're in a continuous aggression line. So you're not allowed to bluff very often, which is a good thing if you're looking to, you know, bluff the river. You don't have to find that many bluffs on, say, a paired river, for example. But the bluffs, again, as mentioned, are not necessarily easy to find because it's not like you just have a flush completing river and have one diamond, you know, where you can just go, I've got a diamond, I blocked the calling range, I want to have a diamond in my hand, let's fire that. On a paired river, it's, as I say, a lot more complex, I think, from the, you know, theory standpoint at least.
Yeah, and I think on these blank rivers sometimes, again, like you say, draw completing rivers, quite often you just want to have blockers which remove value. And on the blank rivers, sometimes you will give up 5 high but bluff a pair or something like this, you know.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah, very unintuitive.
Yeah, I think that ties into as well, like the next little point where we talk about like wide versus narrow ranges. Because usually when ranges get more narrow, bluffs are harder. And it kind of ties into that point you just made, whereby if you imagine you're under the gun versus the big blind, and you have a double Broadway board, you know, it's King, Jack, 5, and then the turn comes down to 10, and then the river's whatever, another 6 or a 6 or something along those lines. In that kind of situation, because of the narrowness of the ranges, if you're in this continuous line, your bluffs on the river very often are going to be low pairs. Like, you know, you need to arrive there with pocket 4s, for example, and bluff the river with it. And this is where a lot of people can go wrong because they don't simply have pocket 4s in their range early on in order to be able to bluff the river. The board, again, is just run out so good for your range overall that you need to bluff higher up. And this is something that a lot of people really do struggle with from, as I say, a theory perspective. Whereas when the ranges are wider, showdown value goes up and you can start checking back more ace high, and you can start checking back more made hands because you win at showdown a lot more and the ranges are a lot wider. So it's a really sort of interesting, again, you know, a little bit of a theory point, but it's important if you're thinking about exploitatively bluffing the river. It's important to know your theory in a lot of situations, at least from a general standpoint, to understand that, well, yeah, I've got an under the gun range here that's tripling off. I don't have many natural bluff candidates in this situation.
Yeah, 100%. And again, because as well, kind of touching a little bit on what you said too, but again, if you're in a wider range scenario where you're not used to bluffing pairs because they have showdown value, it can also be like a spot where you just you're trying to play theory, but you just haven't studied it well enough. Again, this comes back to the knowledge point that we were talking about on the theory slide. Like, you need a lot of knowledge to be able to try and perfectly apply one of these strategies or the global strategy from a theory thing. So yeah, being able to understand the ranges, how they interact, and how that affects post-flop, again, super important. And disconnected versus connected lines, just talk about this very briefly because I think it's quite intuitive, but humans, when you have value, like to bet. I mean, it's pretty obvious why. You have good hand, you want pot to be bigger, right? You want to make money from your villain. Easy. When you have a bluff, not always the case. Equally, when the bluffs aren't intuitive, not always the case. So what tends to happen is that in connected lines, again, this is kind of a data point, I guess, to a degree, but humans tend to be stronger in connected lines than they are in disconnected lines. They tend to fold more in disconnected lines than they do in connected lines. And what do I mean by a disconnected line, Simon? Just like to kind of fill in the gaps.
Yeah, so just any line where your opponent had the opportunity to bet and decided not to. So they decided to check back instead of betting, and then you're in a disconnected line. And yeah, this all comes down to range construction, really. I think is one of my biggest pet peeves, actually, is that, you know, people want to build the pot early on and therefore they front load all of their value, where it's no limit Texas Hold'em. You know, you're not playing pot limit. You don't need to build the pot. You can go all in on the river. It's one of my favorite things to like talk about with range construction. You don't always need to bet. You can check back the turn and you can raise the river all in, and no one can stop you from doing that. So you're not missing value, as a lot of people tend to think. But the overarching point is that when people have the opportunity to bet and then they don't, their range construction, as Patrick said, is so value heavy in the connected lines that they don't have the hands in their range to be able to defend when you bet the river versus them. So they'll very often overfold. You know, blind on blind, you see about the flop, they call, the turn goes check. Very often in that line, you're going to have a really profitable bluff because your opponent would have front loaded their value and bet the turn, and they're not protecting that checking line enough. And therefore, you know, if you've got jack high on the river there, it's very often going to be pretty profitable.
And again, just to kind of expand on that, you've also picked, going back to like pre-flop ranges and interaction, you've picked arguably the widest pre-flop range scenario in the whole of the game tree, BBB, yes. Right?
Yeah.
So you've got like the widest opening range and the widest defense range. Again, so not only have they front-loaded value, but in order to defend their range appropriately, they might have to call absolutely weak hands in order to do so. Again, kind of maybe we can intuit based like partly on data, partly on what we can see from the solver outputs. Like, oh, guy's got a call here with fifth pair like 60% of the time.
Yeah,
I probably expect he's not going to do that. So the data suggests the line's overfolded. The solver suggests maybe actually in practice we can expect this too, with some level of certainty. And then we can kind of infer what that means for our bluffs themselves or whatever. So yeah, that kind of, again, any line, does our opponent have to call absolutely weak hands? There's some level of knowledge that's needed here, again, from a theory point of view. But once we know the answer, we can kind of adjust. And equally, the kind of reverse of that is, do they have to fold absolutely strong hands? Again, this tends to be more in the narrow scenarios where both ranges are really strong. Like you can get river scenarios and single raise pots where the big blind is supposed to fold two pair 60% of the time to all in or something like this. And again, it's just kind of being able to understand the scenarios in which it does versus which it doesn't happen.
Yeah. I think a good point with recreationals on this as well is like we talk about recreationals and we know that they're very inelastic, but generally, like the bigger your river size, the higher up in your opponent's range they're meant to fold, right? So if you 5x pot all in on the river, yeah, you're going to make two pair indifferent very, very often. So this is one thing I always talk about with recreationals. If you are going to, you know, if you do have the nuts, for example, I know this is not talking about bluffing, but if you have the nuts on the river versus a recreational, and you know roughly, you know, if you 10x pot it, they're meant to fold two pair, they're very often just going to overcall you. So just go all in, and it will be the most profitable thing to do when you have value, of course. And then when you're bluffing a recreational, as you're trying to play the hand in a vacuum, pick a different size. Pick a size that's going to be folded more often. If they need to fold two pair for your bluff to break even, then it's probably not the bluff size versus a recreational player.
Yeah, and equally, there's going to be some spots, again, there's no bluff size, which is profitable potentially.
Agree, yeah.
And so actually having the discipline to give up non-showdown value hands and just concede the pot is, again, a skill in itself. But it all contributes to EV, and there's so many considerations. So hopefully this presentation, if you like, has maybe armed you guys with a little better arsenal of tools at your disposal, to think about when it comes to maximizing your EV in game. As we've said at the start of this, there is no right answer. All approaches are viable for different reasons, and it's your ability to take all available information and based on what all of that, make the highest EV decision for you.
Yeah.
And in game.
Yeah. Don't rule anything out. I mean, it's, as I say, whenever I do coaching with people, in the past and so on, it's always, I try to help people build a thought process. And this is what this is all about here. It's not us just telling you what to do and giving you the answers. It's giving you the right tools to think for yourselves at the end of the day. And if you kind of think in the way, okay, well, there's no right or wrong answer. Every situation is going to be individual. Let's think about it and let's try and solve it on the fly. You're going to be in a much better spot than someone who's, for example, just mindlessly copying a solver, or someone who's mindlessly copying data analysis or whatever it might be. You know, the best players in the world are able to understand theory, they're able to understand what humans are going to do, and then they put it all together for the individual situation.
100%, couldn't agree more. And that for me is a great sign off for this this part. We are, as we mentioned at the start of the video, we're going to be doing a second part. That's going to be more on some like hand history examples. We're going to do a bit of pop quiz. Maybe me and Simon are going to, you know, try and trick each other about like testing whether or not we think it's a good or a bad bluff catch scenario and why. Or a good bluffing scenario and why, so on and so forth. But yeah, hopefully you guys will join us for that one. And obviously, hopefully you've enjoyed this segment too.
Yeah, no worries. See you on the next, chaps.
Yeah, nice one. Cheers. Thanks, guys.